All right. Once again, thank you so much for making the time to be here. Welcome to a CoFem Learning Circle. My name is Lucky Kobugabe. I am the Communications and Advocacy Lead for CoFem. And with me is Jean, who will be introducing herself later on. And today we welcome you. CoFem is a coalition of feminists for social change, which is an advocacy collective of thought leaders, activists, feminists, researchers, and everyone working towards ending violence against women and girls. And we often have convenings and gatherings, some that are member only and some that are open like this one. And so today we are going to be thinking through applying feminist approaches to humanitarian action. As we already know, there's so much going on in the world, especially in the field of gender and in the field of ending violence against women and girls, and especially with the funding situation. And one of the thematic areas for COPEM is the humanitarian sphere. And so recently we expressed our concern regarding the proposal to dissolve the gender-based violence area of responsibility into a broader protection cluster as part of the humanitarian reset. And so we thought that while the intent to streamline humanitarian systems is commendable, collapsing the GBV-AOR into the protection cluster such that it no longer functions independently risks undermining many thematic priorities and commitments of humanitarian action, including localization, accountability to affected populations, durable solutions, and the ability to effectively prevent and respond to GBV. I will be sharing the letter that COFEM members put together on the chat. And in line with this, we thought that it would be a great time to have Jean talk us through the guidance note that was put together on applying feminist approaches to humanitarian action. This guidance note considers the question of whether feminist theories and principles hold the potential to help the humanitarian system better meet many of its highest priorities. And perhaps having this conversation right now might be a good reminder of why some of the decisions that are being made in lieu of the humanitarian reset are not so great. And so before I welcome Jean, I'd like to encourage you to please interact on the chat, introduce yourself, share any questions that you might have. I will be monitoring the chat and combining all the questions, and we will have some time at the end to go through the questions and have some more conversations. And so for now, welcome, Jean.
Okay. Thank you, Lucky. Hey, everybody. It's so nice to be here in this CoFem Learning Circle. As Lucky said, my name is Jean Ward. I am coming to you from the United States, where I'm from originally, and have lived now again for about 5 years after living for 15 years in Kenya. I have been working on violence against women in humanitarian and development settings globally for about 25 years. Um, my work covers many different aspects of technical support to UN agencies, to governments, to INGOs, and one of the responsibilities that I have now is as technical advisor to the GBV-AOR help desk, which is, I'll tell you a little bit more about it at the end of the presentation and how to get in touch with the help desk. But it is a free service for those who are working on GBV or violence against women in humanitarian settings. You can write into the help desk and ask them to undertake research on a particular issue or to provide training if you're a local women's organization, other kinds of technical support on issues that are emerging in your work. So as technical advisor to the help desk, I, several years ago, proposed an idea to write a guidance note, what we refer to as a guidance note, which means a kind of longer thought piece on the issue of applying feminist approaches to humanitarian action. The guidance note was published last year, but because, as Lucky said, because of what we're experiencing right now with the humanitarian reset, and because we actually never presented the guidance note to COFEM members, we thought now might be a good time to just really put some of the points that are in the paper at the forefront of people's minds as we navigate the transitions that are happening in the humanitarian space. But first, kind of before I go into why the guidance note and what sort of influenced my thinking, maybe just a little bit of a backstory about my engagement with COFEM, because there's a link to how this guidance note came about and how COFEM came about. I was working on the IASC GBV guidelines, the guidelines on integrating GBV in humanitarian response in around 2013, 14, 15. And some of you may be familiar with those guidelines. They're guidance for non-GBV specialists working in humanitarian response on GBV risk mitigation and prevention, integrating GBV risk mitigation and prevention into sectoral work. And because the guidelines were meant to speak to sectors that did not have a specialization in GBV, it was really important as part of the process of drafting the guidelines to get sectoral buy-in. So really to try and bring as many people on as possible in the drafting process of the guidelines in order for them to support and approve the content. That meant that over the course of 3 years of drafting, piloting, and redrafting the guidelines, we had hundreds upon hundreds of people providing feedback. And in the process of receiving this feedback, there was a very high level, more than I had ever experienced in my work on GBV and humanitarian action to date, a very high level of backlash and pushback on undertaking specialized programming on violence against women in humanitarian action. And managing that pushback while finalizing the guidelines was stressful. Really trying to maintain a separate space for work on the issue of violence against women and girls through the recommendations of the guidelines, that also was stressful. And so for myself, as I was writing those guidelines, I said to myself, after this is over, I'm going to do some advocacy, because I need to get out and speak to some of the issues some of the backlash that I have witnessed in this process. And so it was that I went to some colleagues in the humanitarian space and said, I think we should have a meeting about what to do about this backlash. We got a little bit of funding for a meeting, pulled in GBV specialists from all over the world, a small number. I mean, it was maybe 20 of us, but they did represent, there was a lot of diversity wonderful diversity in the group. And it was during that meeting that we sort of developed the initial idea of what became COFEM, a network that could come together for mutual support and also produce and also do advocacy around sort of key issues emerging in humanitarian and development spaces related to violence against women. And so one of our first things was the SVRI learning papers, which I hope some of you have read. And then the Feminist Pocketbook, which was an idea that another member of COFEM had. So the idea of this pocketbook, she coined that phrase. And so I was very actively involved in the production of those tools because that's really in my work, that's been one of the key ways in which I've sort of communicated ideas is through publications. So so that's the backstory of COFEM. I am less involved with other areas of activism in this field, and so less involved with the other sort of areas of activism that COFEM is currently working on. I was thinking several years ago, what else do I believe needs to be said about how to change humanitarian systems for the better. And because I was a technical advisor for the help desk, I had this entry point to drafting something. And I started to think about the fact that we don't want to just communicate as, as activists, we don't want to just communicate about the importance of resourcing efforts to address violence against women in the humanitarian space. We also want to think about how we can influence these, very highly hierarchical, patriarchal, sort of colonial systems in order to try and improve them. And so that's what I started thinking about this guidance note on how feminist approaches can improve humanitarian action. It started from the idea of or an understanding that we already have evidence, concrete empirical evidence that feminist principles and approaches benefit not just women and girls, but entire communities and societies. And we already have some frameworks in the humanitarian system within the broader UN system that are very supportive of feminist approaches. And there are some priorities in humanitarian action, like localization for however, whatever we think about the word, you understand the concept of trying to really put power in the hands of people who are affected by humanitarian crises. That commitment is really reflective of feminist principles. Accountability to affected populations, creating durable solutions in humanitarian settings. These are sort of broader goals of humanitarian action, and they're really aligned with basic feminist principles. So the question that I sort of had in my mind is, can we speak about how a feminist framework for humanitarian action has the potential to help the entire humanitarian system meet some of its highest priorities? So not just in terms of addressing violence against women or GBV, but in terms of improving the entire humanitarian response. So that was kind of the question that I was reflecting on, and sort of the start of the guidance note. Okay, sorry, hold on. So just so you all know, and Lucky can post the guidance note to the chat, but also I think you've seen the link for it previously. So this is just the content of the guidance note, just to kind of orient you to what is in it and some of the points that we'll be talking about today. It starts with the question of what is feminism, with a recognition of the multiple feminisms that exist around the world and the evolution of multiple feminist theories and practices, and a particular kind of exploration of the rise of international feminism. And then it looks into some of the core principles of feminism. And actually, these core principles were really taken from consultation with feminist experts as a part of drafting this paper, which included consultations with COFEM members. So it was really fun to kind of hear from COFEM members in a meeting, several meetings several years ago about what their reflections were on sort of the key principles of feminism and how to apply those principles to humanitarian action. The paper then sort of looks at the benefits of feminism. It explores feminism in the UN system in some depth. Um, and this is something that actually became a major part of the paper that I hadn't originally anticipated. And the reason is because even I, as someone who has been consulting to the UN system for a very long time, really never reflected on the fact that feminism is very embedded in the UN system. And I think I probably never reflected on it just because on a day-to-day basis, in conversations with colleagues, in work that I do, have experienced resistance and backlash to really elevating the um, even the language of feminism and feminist principles. And actually, that was one of the things that originally, we wanted to do with the COFEM products was to kind of normalize use of the language of feminism when talking about sort of the wider humanitarian response. But this paper was a kind of refresher for me about how so much of the frameworks, the normative frameworks within the UN system are founded in feminist principles or really reference feminist principles. And that's something in our advocacy, I think, to trying to improve the system that we want to remember. Anyway, then the paper goes into talking about the relevance of different feminist principles to key humanitarian agendas, some of the barriers to promoting feminist principles in humanitarian action. Again, these barriers emerged from consultations with colleagues such as yourself and COFEM. And then the paper sort of provides some recommendations about building out feminist ways of working in humanitarian action. So it ends with some recommendations to operationalize feminist ways of working. And we'll come to that later on. So why does feminism matter? You all will know much of the research that's captured in the report about the evidence for the benefits of feminism. It's not new to us. It's just that we really want to constantly reiterate the very significant and positive impacts, socioeconomic development, personal impacts of promoting feminist approaches and feminist principles. So, economic impact in terms of gender equality. There was a very widely known report from the McKinsey Institute that talked about the impact that promoting gender equality could have on the global GDP. So the paper references that. It talks about how we know that feminist approaches improve outcomes in reproductive health, in mental health, and of course in GBV prevention. It addresses the knowledge that we have about how women's participation in the political arena um, and in governance, local and national governance, makes for more inclusive, effective policies um, and government actions, and how gender equality promotes social stability. And this is a really important point for those of us working in humanitarian action, that we have evidence now that more gender equal societies are less prone to internal and cross-border conflicts. So, more gender equal societies tend to be more stable, more peaceful, and resilient. So, promoting gender equality is actually a long-term strategy for um, humanitarian recovery and sustained peace. So we understand, we have the evidence. We don't need we don't have to go far to find very significant evidence about the benefits of feminism. And what's interesting is that the UN already recognizes this because, as I said, there are many ways in which feminism, feminist principles, feminist approaches are already embedded in the UN system. And of course, like some of those, some of the core um, ways in which feminism has been embedded are through the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, the Convention on Ending Discrimination Against Women, but also the Beijing Platform for Women, all of the things that emerged in the 80s and the 90s as through the work of global feminist advocates facilitated by the UN system to build out global gender equality. And then, of course, we have UN Women, which very, overtly embodies a feminist mandate. But we have other agencies like UNFPA, UNICEF, WHO, who explicitly incorporate feminist informed frameworks into their policies and plans. So we won't go in today to system, but I would just encourage you all to reference that for those of you who are working in humanitarian systems, to reference that section of the report. When you experience, as I have, backlash um, in the UN system on promoting feminist approaches and feminist principles, it's already, the commitment is already there. So now, typically, the way that these feminist principles show up in humanitarian work most often is, of course, on our work on GBV prevention and response. So that is, our work that happens through the GBV AOR and through all the subclusters on the ground that have a big influence in terms of getting ensuring that our approaches to this work are survivor-centered and feminist-informed. Then, of course, all the gender mainstreaming, gender transformative programming that exists in humanitarian action and in the women, peace, and security agenda. And so these are core areas where feminist principles are really foundational to the work. But in spite of this, in spite of all the normative frameworks that exist within the UN, in spite of all of the agency commitments that exist to supporting feminist-informed practices on the ground, there are still a lot of barriers to applying feminist approaches in humanitarian action. This section of the paper really draws from the key informant interviews that I had, where I was trying to understand from people I was interviewing what their perceptions were about the gaps between commitments and rhetoric and action. One of the key informants said to me, this is a quote, "Feminist principles have become stuck at the level of technical program interventions rather than the more meaningful level of structural change." So I think what that key informant meant was, we've gotten sort of stuck at talking about feminist approaches in our gender mainstreaming work or in our GBV work, but we're not thinking about how those approaches really apply to the broader humanitarian action. And I should introduce a caveat to that statement, which is that there's been an amazing amount of really good advocacy by different agencies, ActionAid, a number of agencies that have written, and of course, UN Women, that have written specifically about feminism in the humanitarian response and development action. So there's already guidance out there. But one of the areas that hasn't typically been addressed is how specifically do those feminist approaches really improve the likelihood that the humanitarian community is going to be able to meet its broader goals. So some of the additional points that people raised about the barriers, in terms of the technocratic framing, what I mean by that is that key informants were saying that gender often becomes gender transformation and the application of feminist principles. They often become a checkbox rather than something that is driven by a real desire for transformation. Institutional patriarchy. I mean, as I said before, the UN system and the humanitarian architecture still reflect and reinforce traditional power norms. And boy, are we seeing that. I mean that literally, are we seeing that in action right now with some of the discussions that are happening with the humanitarian reset, what we're seeing in terms of what's getting prioritized for defunding globally. And funding, I mean, this issue of defunding that we're dealing with on such a massive scale now has, of course, always been a problem. GBV programs, for example, have been consistently underfunded. So we have, data from different years on that. But when I was writing the paper, there was evidence from 2021, 2022 about GBV programming only being 20% funded. And it may be worse in the coming year. So, so there are a lot of barriers, but and yet, despite the barriers, there may be many advantages to feminist approaches, especially because they're already aligned to key thematic humanitarian agendas. Um, so some of these key thematic humanitarian agendas are accountability to affected populations. A feminist perspective challenges the technocratic decision making and supports attention to and leadership of women and girls. GBV programming is an example of this kind of feminist informed engagement because it is really trying to ensure the consultation and leadership of women and girls and consistently strives to promote their rights and empowerment. Localization, which I already mentioned, the the humanitarian reset that is happening right now is digging deeper into localization because we know from the the 2016 humanitarian summit, how much progress have we made on localization? Not enough. I would say probably the GBV community has made more progress than other sectors in humanitarian action, but we're not anywhere near where we need to be. And applying feminist approaches and principles to humanitarian, more effectively applying those principles can really help us improve our um, commitment to making the work as local as possible. Centrality of protection, is a sort of key framework for humanitarian response. Um, a feminist approach seeks to transform institutions and to reshape power imbalances within a human rights framework that moves beyond viewing affected people as victims and directs attention to the transformational change that's needed to create equality and to eradicate violence. This is core to really being able to centralize protection in humanitarian action. Um, and then the humanitarian development peace nexus. So trying to work at that nexus of humanitarian and development and peace work. Um, Women's rights organizations and women-led organizations consistently work across that nexus. They're always working across that nexus using or almost always working across that nexus using feminist theory and practice to promote women's engagement and leadership in response, in recovery, and in development. So the nexus work is really inherent to what women's rights organizations, women-led organizations are already doing. And another sort of key priority for the humanitarian response is improving humanitarian data. And there's a whole field of data feminism, which I don't go into in great detail in the report, but I think it's worth mentioning that provides a framework for how we challenge power structures using data. And there's a lot of like really interesting work that's being done in SVRI and GW, university, with colleagues in humanitarian settings around the world, thinking about how to improve our data collection so that so that the process of collecting the data is more empowered. Yeah. Okay. So, um, so the paper argues that humanitarian response may never be inherently feminist, right? So we can't say that we're going to make humanitarian response feminist. I think it's dangerous to say that due to the colonial history of humanitarian action, the hierarchical structure. But even if there can't be a feminist humanitarian response, there can be strategies that we can utilize to uplift feminism to improve humanitarian action. And these ideas, drawing from feminist principles, um, really came out in the key informant interviews. So they came out from colleagues like you all. And they really focus on process more than product. And that's one of the sort of key points of the paper is that we really have to think about how we change our processes so that we are engaging more in feminist ways of working rather than sort of looking at outcomes in terms or activities, to checkbox activities for, say, gender mainstreaming. So some of the feminist ways of working that we want to elevate are prioritizing local knowledge, lifting up relational learning, collaboration, reflexive processes, um, really prioritizing local and regional and global feminist networks, promoting and practicing accountability. That's a big one for the humanitarian system, ensuring real participation, not just performative participation, um, highlighting the values of empathy and humility in the work, highlighting the importance of self and collective care, and committing to transparency. So these are some of the sort of core ways of working that if we um, prioritized these ways of working, we might have some better success in actualizing feminist approaches and humanitarian action. The paper, and we're coming to the end of my presentation so we can have time to chat. The paper looks at three areas, potential areas to focus on feminist transformation. It looks at humanitarian leadership, humanitarian coordination, and humanitarian donor engagement. And these are, again, I can't stress enough, so important in terms of the humanitarian reset and the conversations that are happening now. Because the conversations with the humanitarian reset are talking about leadership, coordination, and money. So the paper really draws from in terms of recommendations for improved humanitarian reset leadership. It draws from some of the expertise that's already out there. For example, the learning from ActionAid about integrating feminist leadership into their work. We won't go into detail in it now, but you all can have a look at the paper if you're interested. And then it talks about humanitarian coordination. And so not just that, say, the GBV subclusters on the ground are really working to um, promote the leadership of women's rights organization and women's-led organizations, but that the whole humanitarian community is facilitating that participation and leadership. And there's just very specific processes. For example, the humanitarian needs overviews and the HRPs. There's never enough time. This is a small point, but very important one. There's never enough time to facilitate feedback on the HNOs and HRPs by women's rights organizations, typically. the time allocated is insufficient. And so that's just a way the system undermines the leadership and participation of women in women's organizations. Um, so there are ideas presented about humanitarian coordination and transforming it, and then ideas around donors and feminist ways of funding. And COFEM has actually published a paper on this that is referenced in my paper about some of the principles for feminist funding. And we know that there are a lot of ways in which donors don't engage in feminist funding, especially in humanitarian action, because of their short-term goals, always talking about addressing needs, not looking towards longer-term funding for transformative and structural change. And there's been some, changes in that over the years. I'm working on a different paper right now on that where I'm doing a little bit of research on SURF funding for humanitarian action. And it was maybe in 2021, I think, that SURF declared GBV prevention as something that could be funded through the emergency response fund. So it was an important area for emergency response. So that was a big success. But overall, the donor practices in humanitarian action don't reflect feminist ways of funding. So that's an area for improvement. So the paper looks at these three different areas just as a way to try and operationalize some of the points in the paper. That's how it concludes, and that's where I'll stop today for any sort of questions or reflections that you all might want to share. And while you're thinking, and you can drop stuff in the chat, of course, if you like. But also while you're thinking, let me just tell you a little bit about how to get in touch with the help desk. So all of the help desk products are on the GBVAOR website, gbvaor.org. But you can also contact the GBV help desk directly if you have an inquiry, if you want support from the help desk. You can mail them, send them an email and ask them for support on a different, specific issue. So just a couple of things that I've worked on recently. We drafted a paper for somebody on uh, um, online violence. Right now, someone is doing a training for a women's organization on GBV prevention. Where somebody else is writing a paper on stigma and how that how to address stigma and facilitate access to care and support. So these are just some of the products that come out of the help desk. And if you have a particular issue that you want explored, all of the services are free. Okay.
Thank you, Jean. There are some questions coming up on the chat. And maybe just to share the first two with you. So Dana is saying thank you for the great document and would like to know if it is linked with the ISC gender equality policy. And there's also a question from Kat. Are there any ongoing petitions or event-based campaigns that we can actively join at the moment? And also just for that last one that, like I shared, COFEM shared a letter, an open letter that I'll be sharing again on the chat. But yeah, over to you, Jane.
Sure thing. So in terms of the ISC gender equality policy, there are in the section where it talks about sort of frameworks that reflect feminist principles, that one is referenced, and there are a number of other ones that are referenced. And the point is just to say that these policies and frameworks, they already exist, but the rhetoric that exists within them is not sufficiently informing action. And particularly around gender equality, we see a lot of checkbox activity around gender mainstreaming, which means that the conversations about how to promote gender equality don't address structural change that's required within UN system structures and approaches. So I think that's the thing. So it isn't directly linked, and it isn't actually, the products of the help desk, these think pieces, they go out into the world and they're not shared necessarily in any regularized way. One thought that, I've had about this paper is how do we take some of the recommendations in the paper about ways of working and really introduce these new ways of working on the ground. And maybe that's something that will happen in the future, some conversations, at the field level, say, really doing reflections with women's organizations, and then taking those reflections to OCHA about how to change how the systems are kind of working with women's rights organizations and women's led organizations on the ground. That's one potential area to operationalize some of the recommendations in the paper. But that hasn't happened. We're not there yet. And it probably, if it does happen, it won't happen until after we get through this upheaval.
I think that maybe we have some time for the last few questions. So Bethlehem is asking, how can feminist approaches be practically embedded into the decision-making structures of humanitarian organizations, particularly in contexts where power is already heavily centralized? And the next question is, does your paper incorporate feminist principles to the LGBTQIA+ experience in humanitarian action? Or does it limit the gender experience at only assigned female sex at birth? And lastly, is on how donors can champion feminist-oriented financing. What do donors play in enabling or constraining feminist humanitarian action? And how can funding models be reshaped to support feminist principles more effectively?
So Lucky, I didn't see the first one that you're focused. I'm not seeing the first one.
The first, it's the third, it is the third last one on the chart from Bethlehem.
Okay, the two questions on enabling systemic change. How can feminist approaches be practically embedded into decision-making structures of humanitarian organizations, particularly in contexts where power is already heavily centralized? So it's it's a $1 million question, Bethlehem, but we do have learning from organizations like ActionAid, who have very explicitly tried to build out feminist leadership approaches. And so I think we want to, again, really important that we can't, we're not necessarily going to make the humanitarian system feminist, but the goal is to try and improve the humanitarian system by helping the system to more effectively apply feminist principles and approaches. Um, so really looking at how the sort of ways of working within the feminist system and trying to transform those. And the best way for us to do it is to take them, to take those ways of working to the country level and interrogate how the current ways of working don't apply those principles, and really work with, I think, local women's organizations and women's rights organizations to kind of to develop recommendations for improving the application of those principles. And in the application of those principles, one of the core feminist principles is allyship um, with oppressed, with all just groups that experience discrimination, different, intersecting areas of discrimination. So whether it's discrimination based on, patriarchal norms related to roles for women and girls versus men and boys, or whether it's discrimination based on, ideas of heteronormative masculinity or ideas about sexual orientation or gender identity. In the work to make feminist systems or make humanitarian systems more feminist, the idea is not only to more effectively address the problem of violence against women, which is what I work on, but to really question all power structures that undermine the rights and well-being of different groups. So a feminist approach to humanitarian action ideally is going to recognize and address the rights of all groups who are discriminated against. I think that there's another question here about donors, Lucky.
Oh, yes, there was a question about what role donors play in enabling or constraining feminist humanitarian action, and how funding models can be reshaped to support feminist principles more effectively.
Yeah. So again, there has already been some important writing by COFEM, but also by other, but there right now, especially with the conversations around the defunding, feminist philanthropy networks are coming up to try and or there is the idea of the need for feminist philanthropy networks to come up and address some of the gaps in funding. And also it creates an opportunity for us to inform new donors about how better to support feminist informed humanitarian action. So I think there's a real opportunity here to draw on the guidance that we already have in our engagement with donors to reinforce the fact that shifting back to old ways of working through more traditional humanitarian action is not going to move us forward in terms of our core humanitarian objectives. So, um, so this question that you're asking, Bethlehem, is actually something that I have been thinking about a lot in terms of the humanitarian reset and how we all need to get out and do more advocacy around to donors around it in this inflection point around what the future of funding looks like for humanitarian response, especially as some of the funding shifts to the international finance institutions like IFC or the World Bank, which are also, highly hierarchical and patriarchal organizations. How can those institutions also embrace ways of working that really are transformative?
Thank you so much, Jane. We are unfortunately at time. I don't know if you have any last thoughts that you'd like to share before I close. I think you might have froze up a bit.
Yeah, you just froze, Lucky.
Ooh, sorry.
You're back.
Yeah, no, I was saying that unfortunately we are at time, and I don't know if you have any thoughts you'd like to share before we close.
No, I just want to appreciate everybody. Thank you. Um, with any sort of questions or further reflections, happy to engage.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jean, and thank you so much to everyone who took the time to be here. I hope this was helpful for you. We will have a launch of a new wellness brief that we have in July, and we'll be sharing more information on our LinkedIn, as I have said on the chat. And we look forward to having you again. But thank you so much for being here and for all the amazing questions. And we hope to see you soon again. So have a lovely day, evening, or morning, depending on where you are. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.